Anna Miller had never thought of herself as someone who would become attached to walls, windows, or the play of light across a hardwood floor, but her home had become something more than shelter, something more than real estate. It was a vessel for memory and meaning, shaped by her father's hand decades earlier, when he had drawn every line of the blueprint with care and insisted on building the house with proportions that, as he often said, made sense to the eye and the heart. The living room in particular was his pride, a wide rectangular space with floor-to-ceiling windows angled in such a way that sunlight fell across the floor in a perfect square every afternoon, as though time itself were measured in geometry. To Anna, who had inherited the house after her parents' passing, this room was not simply where she read or hosted the rare dinner for friends. It was the living embodiment of her father's imagination and stubborn precision, a daily reminder that architecture could be poetry and that a home could stand as both refuge and legacy. She worked long hours as a medical technician, sometimes exhausted, sometimes questioning whether her life was moving in the direction she had once imagined in her 20s. But returning to this house always calmed her, because it was the one place where she felt no one could touch her or rewrite the boundaries of her existence. The neighborhood itself was ordinary in many ways, a collection of tidy homes in a suburban development, with lawns trimmed and seasonal wreaths on doors, and behind the surface politeness there lingered the constant murmur of homeowners' association. Rules and letters reminding people of dues and guidelines. Anna had kept her distance from all of that, paying what she had to pay, reading what she absolutely had to read, and otherwise treating the HOA like background noise, the way one might ignore the buzz of a fluorescent light, annoying but not fatal. Her home was her focus, her inheritance, her anchor. When she came home after 12-hour shifts, she would sink into the deep leather armchair her father had left behind, pour a glass of wine, and watch the slow square of sunlight slide across the living room floor, stretching into evening before. Dissolving into the soft shadows of night, it was a ritual as much as it was an observation, and she believed it would last as long as she stayed here, unbroken by anything short of catastrophe. Friends often teased her that she spoke of the house as if it were alive, as though it were a member of her family rather than a piece of property, and Anna would laugh and say, "Well, maybe it is. Maybe it breathes when I breathe." In truth, the house felt like a conversation with her father that had never ended. He had once told her that buildings carry the spirit of those who shape them, and she felt that spirit every time the evening light found its perfect place on the floorboards. She was not naive, not sentimental to the point of blindness, but she trusted in documents, in deeds, in the permanence of property lines drawn on county maps, in the notion that some things were immune to intrusion. She knew the HOA could complain about a fence or about the height of her hedges, but the house itself, its placement, its design, its borders, was something no one could contest. Or so she believed. It was on a pale Saturday morning, the kind where the air felt suspended between spring and summer, when Anna first sensed that something was wrong, although at first she could not place what exactly had shifted in the quiet rhythm of her neighborhood. She had woken earlier than usual, drawn by the soft glare of light spilling through the wide living room windows, and she had made coffee while listening to the faint chorus of lawnmowers and birds. When she stepped outside with her mug, expecting the same calm picture of still lawns and parked cars, she saw instead a group of men in bright neon vests moving slowly along her property line. At first she assumed they were utility workers, perhaps checking cables or pipes, but her stomach tightened when she noticed the equipment they carried: tripods, measuring rods, and the familiar angular devices surveyors use when they map land. The men moved with the clinical detachment of people who already knew where they were supposed to be, driving small wooden stakes into the soil, their fluorescent tape flapping in the breeze. One of them bent down near her porch and hammered a stake directly into the ground that she had always considered unquestionably her own, and when Anna called out, asking what they were doing, the man glanced up briefly, said new survey, and immediately looked back down at his notes as if her question were a distraction rather than a demand. The sound of the hammer striking wood echoed strangely, carrying an authority that felt heavier than it should have, and Anna felt her heartbeat accelerate as she walked toward them. She asked again, louder this time, what exactly they were doing on her lawn, and another man, older, turned to her with the weariness of someone repeating a rehearsed line. Property line adjustment. HOA directive. Nothing personal. His words were flat, bureaucratic, the tone of someone reading instructions off a form, and yet behind them lay something deeply personal, because the line he had just redrawn ran almost flush with the wall of her living room. She stared at the wooden stake now planted firmly in the soil, less than 2 feet from her window, and the absurdity of it momentarily froze her. She wanted to laugh, to insist that such a mistake could not possibly be real, that no one would dare suggest that a structure built 40 years ago by her father was suddenly straddling a boundary that had shifted 20 feet overnight. But the men ignored her, walking further down and driving in more stakes, stretching their bright ribbon from one end of her property to the other as if her protests were no more than background noise. By noon, when the crew packed up their equipment and left without another word, the line of stakes cut a brutal path straight through her garden and directly across her patio, ending almost in the middle of her living room wall. It was as though someone had decided that a slice of her house no longer belonged to her, and had marked it with clinical finality. She stood frozen at her doorway, staring at the violation, trying to comprehend how easily a simple wooden stake could undo decades of certainty. Later that day, a white envelope appeared in her mailbox, stamped with the HOA's crest, and inside was a letter written in the familiar officious tone. According to a newly commissioned survey, the official property line had been corrected to reflect jurisdictional boundaries, and unfortunately, it now ran directly through her home. The letter stated that her house encroached upon community-managed land by approximately 20 feet, and that the HOA would be in contact to discuss remediation measures, including potential modification or removal of the portion of the structure that extended into this zone. Anna read the letter again and again, each sentence more surreal than the last, her coffee growing cold beside her. The language was full of phrases that seemed deliberately vague, words like remediation and adjustment, designed to soften the violence of the claim, but their meaning was plain. They were suggesting she cut off part of her house, the very room that had been her father's pride, the very space that held the sunlight square that gave her comfort every day. She picked up her phone, half ready to call the HOA office immediately, then set it back down, realizing she needed to breathe first to remind herself that there had to be some rational explanation, a clerical error, perhaps even a prank. But when she stepped outside again, the stakes stood where the men had left them, their orange ribbons fluttering like tiny flags of conquest, undeniable evidence that something larger was in motion. That evening, unable to let it rest, Anna walked the length of the stakes with a flashlight, as if the beam might reveal some flaw or irregularity that proved this was a mistake. Instead, what she found made her skin crawl. At the far end of her yard, near the road, someone had already planted a metal sign, polished and official-looking, declaring, "Protected Community Zone. No unauthorized structures beyond this point." The sign stood only a few feet from her mailbox, its arrow pointing directly toward her house, as though the accusation had already been formalized, as though the verdict had already been delivered. She crouched in front of it, running her fingers over the sharp edge of the metal, noting how new it looked, how deliberately it had been installed, and the realization struck her with full force. This was no preliminary measure, no exploratory step. The decision had already been made, and everything else, the surveyors, the letter, was merely a performance to cloak it in the appearance of legality. Anna could not sleep that night. She sat in her living room, staring at the familiar square of moonlight on the floor, which looked distorted now, cut across by the shadow of the stake outside the window. For the first time since she had inherited the house, the space felt vulnerable, as if someone had found a way to pierce the very skin of her sanctuary. She tried to imagine what her father would have said, how his voice would have cut through the absurdity with anger or sarcasm, but all she could hear was the hollow echo of the surveyor's words. Nothing personal. Nothing personal, and yet they had. Just declared war on the most personal thing she had left. When dawn came, the stakes still stood, silent sentinels of an absurd claim, and Anna knew with a sinking certainty that whatever this was, it would not vanish with a phone call or a complaint. Something had begun, and it was not a mistake. It was deliberate, and it was aimed directly at her. The next Monday, after a sleepless weekend spent circling her house like a guard patrolling a fortress under siege, Anna decided she could not delay confronting the HOA. She dressed carefully, not because she wanted to impress them, but because she knew from experience that appearances were their currency, and she refused to give them the satisfaction of dismissing her as careless or emotional. The office was located in a low, nondescript building tucked into a strip of shops. A dry cleaner, a tutoring service, a yoga studio, yet the moment she stepped inside she felt as though she had entered enemy territory. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer when Anna gave her name, and explained that she had received a notice about her property being adjusted. After a pause that stretched too long, the woman said without inflection that the president of the association, Eleanor Crawford, could see her shortly. Anna sat in a rigid plastic chair in the waiting area, staring at the framed posters about community values and neighborhood harmony, every cheerful slogan mocking the storm inside her. When Eleanor Crawford finally appeared, she was exactly the kind of woman Anna had expected. Immaculately dressed in a beige suit, her smile measured and controlled, her voice pitched in that artificially calm tone that people use when they want to dominate by pretending they are above anger. "Miss Miller, thank you for coming in. Let's talk about the situation with your property," she said, gesturing toward a conference room with frosted glass walls. Inside, Eleanor laid out a thin folder on the table and opened it with deliberate precision, as though she were revealing evidence in a courtroom. Inside were maps, diagrams, and the very same letter Anna had received, now duplicated on official letterhead. "As you can see," Eleanor began, tapping one of the maps with a manicured nail, "the recent survey revealed that your home extends 20 feet into community-managed land. This area has been designated for protection under the new ecological zoning regulations adopted last year. Unfortunately, that means your structure is technically in violation." Anna leaned forward, forcing herself to stay calm, though every muscle in her body screamed to shout. "My house was built 40 years ago, designed by my father, with permits approved by the county. There has never been any suggestion that the land was not ours. You can't just decide overnight that the living room is no longer on my property." Eleanor smiled thinly, a smile that carried no warmth. "I understand this is upsetting, but laws evolve, boundaries shift, and sometimes adjustments are necessary for the greater good. We're not here to punish you, Ms. Miller. We want to help you find a solution. Perhaps a modification to the structure, or a negotiated agreement regarding usage rights." The phrasing struck Anna like a slap. Modification, negotiated usage rights. They were speaking of her home, her inheritance, as if it were a shed that could be trimmed or rented out, as if the living room where her father's sunlight square still fell every afternoon was negotiable. Her voice hardened. "You are talking about tearing apart a piece of my house. That is not a solution. That is theft." Eleanor did not flinch. She folded her hands neatly on the table. "I'm sorry you see it that way, but the association must enforce compliance. If you refuse to address the encroachment voluntarily, fines will be assessed, and ultimately, legal action may be necessary. I would advise you to consider your options carefully. This is a sensitive matter." Something in the way she said sensitive matter, with that calm finality, told Anna everything. They did not expect her to fight. They expected her to fold, overwhelmed by bureaucracy, confused by the language of compliance and zoning. They expected her to accept the stakes in her lawn as immovable facts, to accept the idea that the boundaries of her life could be rewritten by strangers wielding clipboards and maps. Anna stood, her hand shaking but her voice steady. "I will not agree to this. I will not touch one brick of my house. If you want a fight, you'll have one." For a brief moment, Eleanor's mask slipped. The smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of something sharper, annoyance, perhaps even contempt, before she quickly restored her calm expression. "That is, of course, your choice. But I must warn you, non-compliance will only escalate matters." Anna walked out of the office, her pulse racing, her chest tight with a mix of fury and dread. She drove home, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only anchor she had left, and when she pulled into her driveway, the sight of the stakes still slicing through her lawn nearly broke her. The orange ribbons fluttered like small, cruel reminders of what she had just heard. Fines, legal action, compliance. That night, she sat in her father's armchair, staring at the distorted square of sunlight as it faded, and she realized that the stakes were not just physical markers. They were warnings. Each one was a nail waiting to be driven into the coffin of her certainty. The days that followed only deepened her unease. Neighbors avoided her eyes, and she could sense a subtle shift in the atmosphere of the street, as though whispers had already spread. Flyers about community zoning updates appeared in mailboxes, carefully worded notices that hinted at ecological concerns and the need for responsible land use. One morning, she found a folded sheet tucked under her windshield wiper, unsigned, with the words, "Don't fight this. They always win." The message chilled her more than anything Eleanor had said, because it spoke of others who had resisted and been crushed, people whose homes or land had already been swallowed under the same calm bureaucracy. Anna refused to let fear make her passive. She began combing through her father's old files, digging through boxes of papers that smelled of dust and age, hoping to find something that could anchor her claim. And, late one night, she did. In a worn envelope labeled Survey 1978, she found an official county map stamped and signed, the very document from when the house was first constructed. The boundaries were clear, bold lines that placed her living room exactly where she had always known it to be. She traced her father's handwriting in the margins, notes he had made about the soil and the angles of the lot, and for the first time in days she felt a flicker of power, a sense that she was not helpless. She had proof, and proof was stronger than stakes or signs. But even as relief swept through her, a dark thought followed close behind. If the HOA had dared to move the boundary 20 feet and install signs overnight, then they already knew the truth. They had chosen to ignore it, confident she would not have the strength or the knowledge to fight back. The battle was no longer about misunderstanding or error. It was about power, and they had just shown her how far they were willing to go to exercise it. Anna had always believed that if you held on to the truth long enough, it would steady you like a handrail on a staircase, giving you the leverage to climb against any resistance. The discovery of her father's original survey map and his handwritten notes became that handrail for her, a tangible reminder that she was not imagining things, that her memories of the property lines were not sentimental illusions, but recorded facts. Sanctioned by the county itself. She placed the map on her dining room table, smoothing it flat with her palms as if it were an ancient relic, and stared at the heavy black lines that defined her home as securely within her lot. The problem was not the truth. The problem was that the HOA had already decided the truth was irrelevant. That realization came crashing down on her one afternoon when she returned from work to find another envelope taped to her front door, this one labeled Notice of Non-Compliance, written in bold, cold letters that seemed designed to mock her. Discovery. The document informed her that her structure was in violation of ecological zoning regulations, and that daily fines would be imposed if she failed to submit a plan of remediation within 30 days. There was no mention of her original deed, no recognition that she might contest the boundary, only the dry certainty of penalties stacking against her like stones in a wall. At that moment, Anna knew she could not fight alone. She began searching for legal counsel, though the very idea made her stomach turn. She was not wealthy. Her income barely covered the mortgage, utilities, and the modest savings she guarded for emergencies. But this was an emergency unlike any she had ever faced, and so she forced herself to start calling attorneys. Many of them dismissed her case before she could even finish explaining, citing the power of HOAs, the costs of litigation, or their lack of expertise in land disputes. Just as she was about to lose hope, she found the number of a woman named Sarah Bennett, a property lawyer whose reputation, according to a colleague at Anna's workplace, was for seeing through the tricks of associations that bullied residents. Anna hesitated before dialing, but when Sarah answered with a brisk voice and said, "Tell me what they've done to you," something inside Anna loosened, and the whole story came spilling out. Every stake, every letter, every thin smile of Eleanor. Crawford replayed in her trembling voice. Sarah did not laugh or sigh with skepticism. She listened, and when Anna finally fell silent, exhausted by the retelling, Sarah said, "This is more common than you think. They rely on fear and confusion. But you have documents?" "Original survey," Anna confirmed, and Sarah replied, "Good, that's your anchor. But we'll need more than proof of your innocence. We'll need proof of their fraud." The word fraud hung in the air, sharp and terrifying, but it also gave Anna a new kind of strength because it reframed the battle. She was not merely defending herself, she was exposing wrongdoing. Over the following days, Sarah guided Anna through a meticulous process of gathering evidence. Anna retrieved every letter she had ever received from the HOA. Every receipt of dues paid, every notice stuffed in her mailbox. Together, they examined the ecological map the HOA had provided, and Sarah immediately noted that it bore no official county stamp. The signature at the bottom belonged not to a government surveyor, but to a consulting firm contracted directly by the HOA, a company Sarah recognized from other cases where boundaries had been mysteriously adjusted to the HOA's favor. Sarah's eyes darkened as she said, "They've done this before. They create their own maps, present them as authoritative, and hope the homeowner is too intimidated or broke to challenge it. If you hadn't found your father's survey, they might have gotten away with it." Encouraged by Sarah's determination, Anna pushed further, combing through her father's old files again, looking for anything that could reinforce her position. In a dusty folder, she found receipts of county inspections from the year of construction, each signed by an official whose name matched the stamp on the survey. It was another layer of authenticity, another brick in the wall of her defense. Yet what struck her most was how deliberately the HOA had ignored all this history, how casually they had chosen to erase it with a new line of stakes and a fabricated map. It was not just incompetence. It was strategy. Sarah warned Anna that the HOA would not back down easily. "They'll escalate before they retreat," she said. "Expect intimidation, more fines, maybe even threats of foreclosure. Their goal is to break you before you can reach court." The prediction proved grimly accurate. Within a week, Anna received a second notice claiming that she had failed to maintain ecological compliance on her property, with photographs attached showing patches of her lawn labeled as wetland vegetation. The absurdity nearly made her laugh, because the photographs depicted nothing more than the damp spots where she had watered her grass the day before. But the laughter curdled into rage when she realized that someone had trespassed onto her property to take those photos, walking among the stakes like vultures circling a carcass. The intrusion left Anna shaken, but Sarah urged her to stay calm. "We'll document everything. Every false claim, every trespass, every piece of intimidation. The more they try, the more evidence we'll have. Still, Anna found it difficult to sleep at night, haunted by the thought of strangers creeping across her lawn, measuring, photographing, plotting the dismantling of her living room as if it were already theirs. She had always thought of her home as impenetrable, but now the walls felt porous, as though the very air inside carried the scent of intrusion. Then came the discovery that shifted the balance even further. While reviewing the ecological map again late one evening, Sarah noticed a small watermark faintly visible under the printed text. With some effort, she magnified it and revealed the initials of the consulting firm. Curious, she dug deeper into their records and uncovered that the firm was not certified to conduct independent surveys. They were registered as land development consultants, their expertise lying not in environmental science but in rezoning projects for commercial construction. The realization struck Anna like a thunderclap. This was not about wetlands, not about ecology or community protection. It was about preparing the land for future profit, disguising a land grab as environmental stewardship. Anna felt a mix of vindication and dread. On one hand, she finally had proof that the HOA's justification was built on lies. On the other hand, it meant she was standing against something larger than petty neighbors with clipboards. She was standing against an organized effort with money and connections behind it. The stakes, literal and figurative, had never felt higher. One night, sitting at her table with Sarah's voice in her ear over speakerphone, Anna whispered, "What if they actually succeed? What if they make me tear down the living room?" There was a long pause, and then Sarah replied, "Then it won't just be your living room. It'll be the beginning of a precedent. That's why we have to stop them now, before they use you as an example." Anna felt her chest tighten with fear, but also with something else. Resolve. Her father had built this house to stand against time, and now it was her turn to make it stand against corruption. She closed her eyes, picturing the square of sunlight on the floor, that perfect geometry of memory and permanence, and swore to herself that no one would redraw the lines of her life without a fight. Anna had thought the notices, the letters, and the photographs of damp soil masquerading as wetlands were as far as the HOA could go, that they had already shown the full scope of their pettiness and aggression, but she quickly realized that the first wave of pressure had only been the beginning. The moment Sarah filed a formal dispute on her behalf, attaching copies of the original county survey and the inspector's receipts, the HOA responded not with silence or hesitation, but with a new barrage of tactics designed to suffocate her into surrender. A week after the filing, Anna returned home to find that bright orange posters had been taped to her front door and fence, each one declaring in bold black letters, "Non-compliant structure." Under review. The notices looked like health warnings plastered on condemned buildings, and she felt a stab of humiliation when she realized that every neighbor who walked past would see them. Children on bicycles slowed to point. An elderly couple paused to read before quickly shuffling away, and by evening she caught a neighbor across the street watching her with a mix of pity and suspicion. The isolation, subtle before, was now absolute. Sarah urged her not to remove the notices, explaining that their very absurdity might serve as evidence, but it was unbearable for Anna to sit inside and feel the weight of invisible eyes. Worse still, the HOA escalated its campaign through official channels. Within days, she received another thick envelope, this one not from the association directly but from the county zoning office, containing a complaint that her home violated ecological preservation guidelines. The complaint had been filed anonymously, but the language echoed word for word the HOA's fabricated map, down to the claim that 20 feet of unauthorized structure extends into designated protective zone. It was clear that the association had gone beyond internal pressure and was now using outside agencies to entangle her in red tape. Anna drove to the zoning office in person, clutching her father's documents like a shield, only to find herself shuffled between clerks who treated her like another case file rather than a person. One finally admitted, lowering her voice, that such complaints were common in neighborhoods where the HOA had strong influence. The phrase unsettled Anna more than any threat Eleanor Crawford had made directly, because it suggested that the reach of the association extended beyond fences and lawns into the very offices meant to protect citizens. She left with the sickening realization that the fight was not confined to her street, but woven into the larger machinery of bureaucracy. The harassment on the ground grew worse. One evening, Anna came home to find that someone had driven metal stakes into the edge of her patio, each topped with small yellow flags like the markers used before construction. They were placed with clinical precision, slicing across the stone tiles her father had laid by hand, and for a moment she could hardly breathe at the sight of them. She called Sarah, her voice trembling, and Sarah told her to photograph everything but not to touch the stakes. "They're baiting you," Sarah warned. "If you remove them, they'll accuse you of tampering with official property markers. They want you to make a mistake." So the stakes remained, stabbing into her patio like accusations, reminders that her own home was no longer entirely hers. One night she woke to the sound of hushed voices outside her window. She froze, her heart pounding, listening to the crunch of feet on gravel. Peering through the curtains, she saw two figures in reflective vests moving along the side of her house, shining flashlights onto the ground, whispering as they jotted notes on clipboards. She wanted to fling open the window and shout at them, but fear held her still. After 10 minutes they moved on, disappearing into the dark, leaving behind another set of small flags in the soil. When she called the HOA office the next day demanding to know why people had been trespassing on her land in the middle of the night, the receptionist coolly replied that occasional inspections may be conducted at any time to ensure compliance. The casual audacity of the response left Anna speechless. By now, the harassment was taking a toll on her sanity. She found herself unable to sleep without leaving lights on, and she jumped at every sound of footsteps outside. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now crossed the street rather than pass in front of her house, and she overheard snatches of conversation about illegal construction and lawsuits when she walked by. It was as though the association had poisoned the very air around her, turning community into suspicion. One morning, she discovered that someone had scrawled the words, "Move the wall," in chalk across her driveway, the letters large enough for everyone to see. She washed it away quickly, but the image burned in her mind long after. Through all of this, Sarah remained steady, reminding Anna that every act of harassment only strengthened their case, that they were building a record of intimidation and fraud that no court could ignore. Yet Anna could not shake the sense that the association was always 2 steps ahead, pressing harder every time she regained her footing. The lowest point came when she received a letter from a real estate development company, informing her that they were interested in acquiring her property for a future project and offering a sum far below market value. The implication was unmistakable. The HOA's manufacture dispute was laying the groundwork for her to be forced into a sale, after which the land could be repurposed without obstacle. Anna sat in her living room that evening, staring at the square of sunlight as it crawled across the floor, but instead of peace, it filled her with a cold fury. For the first time, she understood with clarity that the stakes in her lawn were not simply about compliance or bylaws. They were about greed dressed in the language of regulation, and she was the obstacle standing in the way. The association had chosen her house not because it threatened wetlands or violated rules, but because it was valuable, and because they believed she was too isolated to resist. That night she made herself a promise. She would not be baited into mistakes, she would not be broken by fines or gossip, and she would not sell a single brick of her father's design. If they wanted to push her further, they would find she had claws of her own. The day of the hearing arrived with a weight that pressed against Anna's chest from the moment she woke. For weeks she had lived under the suffocating rhythm of notices, stakes, and whispers. each new tactic from the HOA designed to erode her will. But now the conflict had shifted into a forum where evidence, not intimidation, would decide the outcome. She walked into the county courthouse with Sarah beside her, clutching the folder of documents that had become her lifeline. Her father's original survey, the stamped receipts of inspections, the photographs of intrusions, and the forged ecological map that had been paraded as fact. The room where the case would be heard was small, paneled with dull wood, filled with an audience of neighbors, HOA board members, and a few curious onlookers. Eleanor Crawford sat at the far table, her posture immaculate, her expression carrying that same thin smile Anna had come to recognize as a mask of superiority. To Eleanor, this was not merely a dispute, it was an exhibition of authority, and she carried herself as though victory were already decided. The proceedings began with the HOA's attorney presenting their case, stacking papers with theatrical precision, speaking of ecological compliance and revised zoning regulations. They projected maps onto a screen, including the one with bright blue shading that claimed Anna's living room sat inside a protected wetland zone. The attorney's voice was smooth, persuasive, layered with technical jargon designed to overwhelm anyone without specialized knowledge. When he gestured toward the screen and declared that the association had no choice but to enforce compliance in the interest of community preservation, a murmur of agreement rippled through some of the audience. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, lips curved as if savoring the performance. But when it was Sarah's turn, the tone of the room shifted. She began without theatrics, her voice steady and deliberate, first acknowledging the importance of ecological protection, then dismantling the HOA's argument piece by piece. She placed the original county survey on the judge's desk, stamped and signed from 1978, and explained that the boundaries had never been altered by any official ordinance. She held up the receipts of inspection, each one bearing signatures from county officials who had verified compliance at the time of construction. Then she turned to the map presented by the HOA and asked one simple question. Why does this document bear no county stamp, but instead the watermark of a private consulting firm whose expertise is in land development, not environmental science? The silence that followed was sharp, broken only by the shuffling of Eleanor's papers. Sarah pressed further, pointing out inconsistencies in the scale of the map, the absence of soil studies, the fact that the supposed wetland vegetation photographs showed nothing more than watered grass. Bit by bit, the scaffolding of the HOA's argument began to collapse. The decisive moment came when Sarah produced the letter Anna had received from the real estate company offering to buy her home at a reduced price. She placed it beside the HOA's non-compliance notices and spoke with quiet intensity. This is not about wetlands, and it never was. It is about profit. It is about using the language of compliance to pressure a homeowner into surrendering valuable land. My client's house is not an environmental hazard. It is an obstacle to a financial scheme. The words cut through the courtroom like a blade, and even those who had muttered agreement before now sat upright, eyes darting between the HOA representatives. Eleanor's composure faltered for the first time, her smile thinning into a hard line, her fingers tapping the table as though she could will the moment away. The judge, who had listened in silence until then, leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the fraudulent map. His questions came quick and precise. Why had the HOA relied on a private firm instead of county surveyors? Why had notices been issued without official verification? Why had trespasses occurred at night without the homeowner's consent? Each question chipped away at the authority Eleanor had wrapped around herself, and by the time she attempted to answer, her words sounded brittle, defensive. The judge's final remark carried the weight of conclusion. This court finds the recent survey invalid and the enforcement actions unjustified. The original property boundaries remain in effect. Furthermore, this matter will be referred to the district attorney's office for investigation of possible fraud and misuse of authority. The words washed over Anna like a tide breaking against stone, releasing a tension she had carried for weeks. She closed her eyes for a moment, gripping the edge of the table as relief mingled with disbelief. Around her, whispers rose, some neighbors turning to each other in shock, others glaring at the HOA board as if seeing them for the first time. Eleanor remained seated, her face pale now, her mask stripped away, her composure unable to withstand the fact that her authority had been broken publicly. For once, it was she who seemed small, diminished by the weight of truth laid bare before everyone. As Anna walked out of the courtroom with Sarah at her side, the afternoon sunlight felt different, sharper, warmer, as though the square of light she cherished at home had followed her here. For the first time in weeks, she breathed deeply, unafraid of what might be waiting on her lawn, knowing that the stakes and signs had lost their power. The battle was not yet finished. The investigation would take time, and the HOA might still cling to its power in other ways, but the climax had passed, and the house her father built still stood, unbroken, its boundaries reaffirmed not by intimidation, but by truth. When Anna returned to her house after the hearing, she paused at the edge of her driveway and looked at it as though seeing it for the first time, no longer through the haze of fear and encroachment, but with the clarity of someone who had endured a storm and found the walls still standing. The orange stakes were gone, removed by order of the court, and the cruel metal sign declaring her living room an unauthorized structure had been pried from the soil, leaving behind only a shallow scar in the ground. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her now glanced her way with hesitant nods, some even offering quiet words of apology, as though they had only just realized how easily they had allowed themselves to be swayed by rumor and the manufactured authority of the HOA. It was not forgiveness Anna sought, but their acknowledgement carried its own strange weight, a reminder that silence can wound as much as open hostility. Inside, the house greeted her as it always had, sunlight spilling into the living room in that familiar square, the same light her father had designed it to capture, the same light that had anchored her when she thought she might lose everything. She stood in the center of it and let the warmth settle on her skin, knowing now that this pattern of light was more than memory or ritual. It was defiance, the visible proof that her home belonged where it was, and that no shifting line or false map could erase the permanence of its foundation. The investigation into the HOA's practices would stretch on, and Sarah warned her there might be more battles ahead. But the balance had shifted. Eleanor Crawford had resigned from her post within days of the judgment, and whispers of board members being questioned by county officials spread quickly through the neighborhood. For the first time since the surveyors had appeared, Anna felt the air on her street grow lighter, as though the invisible net of intimidation had begun to unravel. That evening she brewed tea and carried it out to the patio, sitting in the chair her father once used to occupy on summer nights, and looked across her yard with a steadiness she had not felt in months. The marks left by stakes and flags would fade. The chalked words on her driveway were already forgotten, but the lesson carved into her was permanent. Boundaries were not simply lines on paper, they were lines of dignity and belonging, and to let. Others redraw them. Unchallenged was to surrender more than land. It was to surrender selfhood. She raised her cup slightly, as if toasting the quiet garden and the stubborn square of sunlight inside, and whispered into the dusk that the house had stood, and would continue to stand, not just as shelter, but as proof that some legacies could not be moved.